KP.
KPC.
News.
Information. Culture. KPCC.
California sensibility.
Blackbird singing in the dead of night.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Lehrer.
And I'm Amy Choi, and we are the Mashup Americans. And today, we're talking about religion.
All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arrive.
So Pew recently shared a stat, which is that 30% of Americans believe that being Christian is essential to American identity. So neither of us are Christian. As you know, we're obsessed with American identity. So we thought it might be worth asking and exploring a little bit about religion. And so I thought maybe I'd ask you, Amy, what your spiritual practice is.
Well, so I was raised kind of, sort of in the Presbyterian Korean church in the Midwest. But for us as an immigrant family, church wasn't so much about faith as it was about community. You know, my parents weren't believers, but we went to church because that's where Saturday school was, that's where Korean language instruction was, and that's where all the other Korean families in the greater Chicagoland area were.
Wait, reminder, what is Saturday school?
Saturday school is like where you go to do kind of Korean cultural exercises, and the teacher, some of it is language instruction. So you get these worksheets where you're stenciling out Hangul. I mean, I have very, very profound memories tied to that. Maybe not the most positive ones. Anyway, so I will say that going to Korean church in the Chicago in the 80s, it didn't have a real impact on my spiritual life. Mm-hmm. But this is going to sound really cheesy, and this is not some eat, pray, love nonsense. But I came into my spiritual beliefs as an adult in India. I had been traveling there for a couple months with my husband, and it had been the first time in my life that I was in a place and among people for whom talking about divinity and talking about holiness and talking about prayer was something that happened at every moment of the day. It was just a daily experience. And so it was while working there that I kind of came to the understanding that for me, service is my path to divinity. So everything I do, I can do with the lens of how does this serve others? How can I serve others better with the choices that I make? And how do my daily choices really, whether they're consumer things, do I buy this brand of whatever, or do I send my kids to public school, or am I, nice to this guy who's being an asshole? How does that kind of daily experience bring me closer to God? So that's that.
By the way, I love Deep Pray Love, so I don't want to but I understand what you're saying.
Yes, thank you.
Obviously we've talked a million times about how I'm Jewish and raised within the tradition with attendant rituals, and I still practice that. And when I think about my daily spiritual practice, I think it's really maintaining my sense of awe. So some days are bigger awe days than others, right? Swimming in the ocean with turtles and feeling how small I am and how big and awesome nature is. And so some days are just, wow, this food, I get to eat this amazing food, or I get to use my voice, or I get to call my grandma on Skype. Isn't that amazing? And so
it is actually amazing.
It is. You should hear her talk about how the technology works. That's also amazing.
But I think that's so important. The idea that our spiritual practice can be the tiny, tiny little quotidian things in our life, and also be and try to embrace the enormity that is the natural landscape in which we live, and we're this tiny.
I know.
vessel.
And then you're the stars are actually bigger than the earth. And then you're I can't. It's too much.
I know. It also makes your brain explode.
Yeah. But I'm not an expert, and you're not an expert.
Though we like to pretend every once in a while.
You guys, fake it till you make it. Fake it till you make it. That's why we called in Krista Tippett, the mellifluous voice at the center of the American conversation about spirituality, faith, and all the like. She's the host of On Being and author of Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living, Einstein's God, conversations about science and the human spirit, and Speaking of Faith, why religion matters and how to talk about it.
Guys, she's literally won every award that exists out there. And having talked to her, we now know why. We are so excited. On to the show.
All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. You were only waiting for this moment to arise.
So this is a question, Krista. In your natural state, are you a curly or are you a straight-haired lady?
My hair is, I think, wavy, and it depends on the humidity.
Yes.
But also, my hair changed dramatically when I got pregnant. After I had,
God, the
I
world
have
is so
different
crazy.
hair after like my mid-30s than I had before, and it's much curlier. Like in the summer, it's naturally curly, but in the winter, that curl, right now it's really cold and dry in Minnesota, and my hair is very straight. So it's confused. It's very strange for your hair to change personality because it's such an elemental building block of who you are.
So, Krista Tippett, how do you mash up?
I am a journalist, theologian, mother, and also a little girl from a small town in Oklahoma. I fled for my life when I was 18, but it's always with you. I'd like to say something about there's a certain unease, like even a sadness in me, just at this question, because part of my story, of the background of my life, is growing up in a place where people came to flee history and to flee their backgrounds. There's a very thin layer of culture when you don't let history in. And my father even was adopted. So that whole genetic side of me remained a great mystery. And then on my mother's side, where at least there was a story, no one cared too much about those stories. And I think it's taken me a long time to feel like you have to create yourself out of whole cloth, which is another kind of American story. And it is a mashup too, but you have to even invent the materials you're working with.
That idea of creating yourself from whole cloth and crafting your own identity, I think that's actually something that Rebecca and I, in many mashups, is very alien to us in some way because, we are very deeply rooted in cultural traditions and in faiths and in ethnic traditions. And we think about how do we create a new American one while still honoring the ones of the past. It's fascinating to think about when you don't have that intimate connection to a, quote, past.
It's less unusual than you might think in certain parts of the country. But I think it's a form of impoverishment, Because, in fact, none of us creates our lives out of whole cloth, right? I mean, that's a fiction. And it's also very stressful to do that. It's not natural. I mean, right? I think as humans, as creatures, we need each other. This is a fundamental reality of our species. We can forget that. We can pretend like it's not true. We can forget where we came from. We cannot pass that on. But it still remains true in our bones. And so it's a lonely thing to imagine that you have to create your persona, your identity out of whole cloth. And
But it's also quite American. I mean, in
It is.
what you're saying, it's so American in that,
it's so American.
when you think about in most parts of the world, people continue to live at home when they're 18. And I know you have an 18-year-old, and I don't know about where they're living, but, here, so very often you're leaving home, going to college. You may live across the country. And I know several studies about people's religiosity over or relationship to their religious background over time and who they end up marrying, actually, is impacted because if I'm moving across the country from my parents, or far away from them, then I'm maybe not as integrated into the religious community I grew up in and more open to people from different backgrounds and therefore exposed to that. And I can kind of be whatever I want to be in that moment. And not to say that I'm not completely informed by where I'm coming from, but there's something like in Spain, somebody lives with their mom until they're 40,
Right.
like they're just, and maybe when they're
And then they
married,
move across the street.
yeah, or their wife moves in and everybody lives together. I mean, it's a different sense of knowing where people come from and who they are.
Yeah, and I even think that the nuclear family, which is a very recent invention, right, and here, is also another way we separated ourselves from the way we'd always lived, the way we'd always loved, the way we raised our children, and, as you're saying, transmitted identity and history. But again, I keep coming back to this word lonely. Like I said a minute ago, I don't think marriages and kind of what we call the nuclear family are supposed to be alone. Traditionally, even that kind of love is held in a larger web of relationships.
Do you think that that loneliness is what drives people to seek out spirituality or a community of faith?
It's one of the things people find in faith and in religious community that's not a given in the rest of life anymore. I think that's also one reason in our time, many people grow up without much of a strong religious formation, especially compared to previous generations. And yet this longing doesn't go away. And we have so many ways to seek that and to learn, to pick up the spiritual search ourselves at some point in life. But I see often that when people do start walking down that path and taking it seriously, even if they pick it up really independently of any kind of tradition or identity, at some point they start turning to community and ritual. These are core aspects of faith that have been carried forward in time and across generations, along with the practices and the texts and the teachings, and they belong together.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound.
If you guys love the stories we share, sign up for our newsletter at mashupamericans.com/newsletter. Every Saturday morning, you'll get our roundup of mashup news from around the world delivered right to you. It'll make you think, laugh, and have your thoughts provoked. Could there be a better way to wake up on the weekend? We think not. So do it. mashupamericans.com/newsletter.
But now I'm found was blind, but now I see.
You grew up Christian, right? Or you grew up in the church?
Yes, yeah. No, I grew up Southern Baptist, and I would say if I had an identity, that would have been one of the strongest pieces of my identity growing up, would be being Southern Baptist, being at church 3 times a week.
What is your first memory of church?
Wow, I don't think anybody's ever asked me that. Well, my grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher. I think it was something about, seeing him in the pulpit, like being at his church. He taught he preached, he went around to little churches all over the state, and we would go with him sometimes.
How do you feel about that line in Hamilton about the fire and brimstone preacher?
That's how I grew up, hellfire and brimstone.
Do you remember as a kid feeling spiritual? Or was it just this is what life is church 3 times a week, my grandfather on the pulpit? Was it a religious experience for you, or did it evolve into one?
The religiosity of my childhood had a lot to do with rules. It was about hellfire and brimstone, and there was a lot of fear in it, and ways that the world was a perilous place and things you could go wrong. There was a lot of drama in it, honestly, which I think for a child is pretty fascinating, So it was the threat of eternal damnation, but it was also this God of love, this love that permeated the universe, which I would say is a great gift to be offered, that sensibility, even if it was kind of internally contradictory. But if I think about what was spiritual for me growing up, I think that was as much about, let's say, the music and the singing, the hymns. That's where I see myself having spiritual experiences when I think back on that. And by that I mean that it was going through my whole body, right? So this is
right.
And this is as I've gotten older and as I've done this show for these years, I don't really believe in anything that's merely spiritual. I'm not that interested in anything that's merely spiritual. For me, spirituality is embodied. And it was in the singing, but also I would say in the singing, right, surrounded by the community. that I see that depth. And, you know, I have beautiful, again, like embodied memories of that. You know, I can almost take myself back there.
It's funny you say that, actually. Every time I hear gospel music, I always call Amy and I'm like, if
just
this
here
is how they
weeping.
want to get me, I'm in. They can take this Jew and make her Christian, because this music is moving me. It is like it absorbs my whole body, and I need tips on how to get there, how to get in that zone.
I see that everywhere. I really see that when spirituality is deep and meaningful, it is in the body. Ritual, I just think we need ritual, right? And that's a part of religious experience, and that is about tethering spiritual feelings and ideas to movement, right? To flesh and blood. And if we don't get it in synagogue or church, we recreate it, even if we recreate it with the way we have a sacred space of our first cup of coffee in the morning, right? Or with our children, you know, we create rituals because somehow we need this, and it does anchor us. The conversation that comes to mind for me about that is not about religion, but it speaks to this. It was a conversation I had years ago with a yoga teacher, a really wonderful yoga teacher who's also paraplegic. So he was paralyzed from the waist down in a car accident when he was 13, and his father died and his sister died.
Oh my God.
For like 20 years, what the doctors did, and other well-meaning people, as they said, you know, forget your legs, they don't work. You know, you can have bodybuilder arms. But at some point, he wanted to connect his body up. And he started doing yoga. Somebody taught him yoga. And he's now he does adaptive yoga for people with disabilities and kind of yoga for people with all body. Yoga has also become a way for me to get into my body in a way that's been really transformative. Anyway, he spoke this sentence that I've never forgotten. And he said he'd never known anybody become more at home in their bodies, in all its flaws and its grace, without becoming more compassionate towards all of life. And you know, in Hebrew and in Arabic, also the word for compassion is connected to the root word for womb, rooted in this intimacy of physical relationship. And I'll tell you, I once interviewed this great theologian, Walter Brueggemann, who's just this amazing. He's a Christian scholar of the Hebrew prophets. Somehow this came up with him about this, with the word compassion and womb, and and I said something about how beautiful that was, and this man, right, is actually what he said. Well, he said, yes, there's a lot of beauty about the image of the woman giving birth, but it's also very uncomfortable. And I thought, yeah, well, I know that better than you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's actually a great image to really think about the fullness of that, you know, womb metaphor for our relationship to others.
There's something about that physicalness that reminds us that it's attainable because it's just us. These are our bodies and our physical limbs, and it's not an intangible that you have to necessarily think about so hard. Like, if you can be compassionate with your body, you can be compassionate with other people's bodies, and that can be your spirituality, that connects you to a spiritual life in some way. I know that for me, it's always really important to strip away what seems unattainable or like not for me-ness about thinking about spirituality.
Yeah.
That, like, to make it more human always feels really essential. So I'd love thinking about this theologian being like, well, the womb also, there's some crazy stuff that happens in there, and it can hurt, and it can be things that you don't want to talk about. It's very indelicate because that's real, and it's things that we can relate to,
and that our humanity stems from there, and compassion is so fundamental to our humanity, right? So, especially like with technology, that it kind of is the opposite of being in your body.
Yes, that's right.
I feel like I get these headaches now. It's funny. It's because I'm staring at my phone, the onslaught of news, and staring at my phone, and I'm like, I'm not in my body. Like, I feel that physically pain, but that I'm not embodying who I am or what I want to be, and I feel like a muddied energy. Now I'm going to get very California on you guys, but that's what I talked about. I was feeling like a very muddy energy, and I'm trying to get some clarity around it. I'm very sorry. I'm going to do some Reiki, but
I think you need to juice.
I know,
Definitely.
Well, there's definitely some juicing happening here.
So, Krista, I want to get to a question that I think is people want to live a more spiritual, connected life, but it's hard to even know what that means. So what does it mean to you to live a spiritual life?
I wish I could give an answer to that question. I mean, I really do think we all have to work that out kind of in fear and trembling with the raw materials of our lives, I mean, I think of Christianity as the mother tongue and homeland of my spiritual practice. And there's so much about the Southern Baptist tradition that I grew up in that's fallen away, the particularities. But Christianity is that mother tongue, And so someone said to me early on, a wise person said, don't let your tradition be defined by the worst examples of it.
Oh, wow.
Right. Now, I do think there's something natural that happens that we do. It's this human process of growing up and questioning and separating in order to be yourself, right? And I think we kind of do with our faith traditions, if we grew up in one, what we do with our parents. We come to some point where it's just all wrong.
Right.
I think it is important, even just to acknowledge that there's a vocabulary we grew up with, a homeland, and at some point to interrogate that. And honor that as part of us, even if we have rejected it. When I wrote the Becoming Wise book over the last few years, I was actually starting out with this image of spiritual genius, which was a phrase of Einstein. And and this question people have asked me across the years about all the wise people you've interviewed, these big spiritual lives, what are the common denominators? And I started out with kind of a lofty vision of that. I mean, it's a kind of a lofty version of the question you're asking, which is, how to have a spiritual life. And the more I looked at it, the more I kept going closer and closer and closer to the ground of life. And realizing that people who are wise, people who are deeply spiritual in a way that imprints the world around them, right, as opposed to just having a, big spiritual experience, that emerges through the raw materials of their lives, the words they speak, the way they inhabit their body.
What they tweet.
This is a new aspect to the historical view of how wisdom emerges. We probably have to add a new category of how they work with technology.
Yeah.
And I just want to say one last thing, because I almost said this a few times. If you think about the wise people you've known and the most spiritual people you've known, they probably have a smile on their face.
A few years ago, my husband and I, we were in India, in Bihar, and we were doing a Buddha pilgrimage, and we ended up in Bodh Gaya, which I don't know if you have been there.
I haven't been there, but of course I know.
Yes. So for our listeners, Bodh Gaya is where Buddha attained enlightenment. You can pay your respects and pray, and it's like there's like a UN of Buddhists there. So there's like Buddhists from Myanmar and Thailand and India, and everybody has their spaces, and the monks are all there either on pilgrimage or praying or living there. And we were at one temple. It's like reverent and beautiful, and there's a wheel, and then I look up, and along the railing of the living space is like a maroon robe hanging over the edge and like a yellow scarf, and I was like, oh my God, that's monk laundry. That's their laundry, just like right, like on the railing of their apartment.
Maybe that should be our meditation word is monk laundry.
Monk laundry. Right. And I was like, oh right, monks have to do laundry.
I think you're getting at something that just feels more and more important to me, that, to this big question, like, how do I do this? How do I have a spiritual life? How do I become wise? Just kind of pointing back to the fact that in our experiences of our lives, our loves, our families, the wise people we've come in contact with across our lives, we actually possess a well of intelligence that we just could take so much more seriously. And I feel that we could extend this intelligence to our kind of life writ large with our fellow Americans.
Totally.
You know?
The kind of modern narrative is that faith is what creates a moral compass in America. And we demand this of many of our political leaders, at least. Like, do you really go to church? Do you believe in God? How important is religion in creating that moral compass, or is it really our community and this this intelligence that you can derive from your daily life and from our elders that creates our moral compass?
Our great traditions are these repositories, right, of across time, teachings and texts and beliefs and practices and rituals that, are this deep well of that. Having said that, our traditions also, religions are containers for those truths. These are containers that are fashioned by human beings and led by human beings and carried forward in time by human beings and sometimes dropped and broken by human beings. Yes, faith is one of the great sources of moral imagination. It is the human discipline that was created for that, but it doesn't necessarily provide that, right? And also, I would want to distinguish between lived faith and how often somebody goes to church, right?
Right.
Those things may correlate, but they may not. That intelligence that you have from your daily experience, John Lewis, the civil rights hero, he told me about how when they were spiritually preparing themselves for their activism, which they did with incredible discipline, they trained themselves to look at anyone, including somebody who was beating them, and to remember that that person at some point was a little baby, and to wonder, to actively wonder as a way of putting themselves into the kind of relationship they wanted to be. What happened? What happened to that little baby to bring them to this point? Just speaking of American identity, there's so many ways American Christians have conflated what it is to be American and what it is to be Christian, to the point that people don't really, truly are not aware of the difference anymore. It's not even their fault.
Pew just released this tidbit.
Oh, yeah.
That 30% of Americans believe that being Christian is essential to an American identity. And neither of us being Christians, that feels alienating, as you can imagine. But 70% of Americans are Christian. Does that surprise you how much that is conflated?
I guess so. When I hear that, and I when I read it in the New York Times, which is where I would read it, what is communicated, and I understand this because there's also this side of me. How stupid is that, right? How wrong, how narrow-minded, how ignorant. I also know that that's what I grew up believing. It infused. Church wasn't just a place of religion. It was a center of social life. It was everybody I knew, and so people are internalizing these things, and that they've been internalizing them for a long, long time. And that doesn't make this any more complicated or difficult or distressing. But I guess what's really important to me now with anything like that, or with just our, the divide writ large in our political life, that we not assume flawed character or intelligence in the people who hold different positions. I think there are different callings right now, and there are certainly there's certainly things that need to be resisted, and I think some of us are going to be called to like place our bodies in front of people who are threatened. There have been people threatened and vulnerable for a long time in our midst, all kinds of people of all kinds of races and ethnicities and social classes who we haven't been paying enough attention to.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time that there's that calling, there's this much quieter calling to kind of move towards others in a spirit of wanting to understand, willing to be surprised, and creating relationships in which new kinds of information can be exchanged in a trustworthy, respectful spirit.
As a person who's been asking questions about like the most vast and unknowable subject as a career move, Krista, is,
Right.
and like, is there ever an answer? Or like, do we ever stop? Or is this, all of this, is it always in the seeking?
I don't think it's always in the seeking. I mean, I think also we're called to be discerning truth. And when we see a piece of the truth and we can put words around it, that's a beautiful thing. And that's also something we offer to the world. However, I do believe that faith has an evolutionary quality. I think it has an evolutionary quality in any individual life and in a culture. And when I say that, I'm not honoring people who have a very strong identity that they maintain all their lives, right? But I still think somebody who has a dynamic and ever deepening spiritual experience, even if there's a piece of conviction that they've held all their lives, right? That, let's say, even this, I believe in God, Somebody with a deep spirituality who's been able to say that sentence all of their lives, it still had very different connotations when they were 12, when they were 25, when they were 55, when they were 80. So there's evolution in the meaning of what we believe and the way we live that across our lives if we are truly alive.
Amen, as they say.
Amen.
Thank you, Krista.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be with you.
You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, well, you might find you get what you need.
That was Krista Tippett, and she is basically everything that we need right now. So it was just such an honor after hearing her for so many years, and so helpful to get a little perspective. You can find On Being at onbeing.org or anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also get the paperback version of Becoming Wise, which is coming out at the end of February.
I just love the idea that the wisest, most spiritual people in the world are always smiling.
New mantras: monk laundry, always smile.
Everybody poops.
Everybody poops.
Everybody poops. Yes, monk laundry. Anyway, we want to hear about your mantras and spiritual practices. Share with us on Facebook at facebook.com/MashupAmericans or write to us at yo@mashupamericans.com.
The Mashup Americans are me, Rebecca Lehrer.
And me, Amy Choi. Our producer today was Jocelyn Gonzalez. Our show is produced by American Public Media and Southern California Public Radio, KPCC.
We're also supported in part by an award from the National Endowment for the Arts on the web at arts.gov.
Amen, sister.
Amen.
But if you try sometime, you just might find you get what you need.